Right now, there's a silent battle happening in your mind that most people never even realize they're losing. It's not loud. It doesn't feel dramatic. It shows up as hesitation, overthinking, second guessing, and that quiet voice that tells you to wait, to delay, to doubt yourself just a little longer. And without noticing it, that voice becomes the reason you don't act, the reason you don't speak up, the reason you don't take the opportunity that could have changed everything. Here's the truth most people avoid. It's not the world holding you back. It's the thoughts you keep allowing to run unchecked in your mind. Every negative thought you repeat is not just a thought. It's a signal your brain starts to treat as reality. And once your mind accepts something as reality, your behavior begins to follow it without resistance. That's how people slowly drift away from their potential without ever realizing where things went wrong. But what if the problem isn't that you have negative thoughts? What if the real problem is that no one ever taught you how to respond to them? What if the difference between the life you have and the life you want is hidden in a single moment? The moment right after a negative thought appears. Because in that moment, you either reinforce it or you take control of it. And that one decision, repeated over time, quietly shapes your confidence, your mindset, your actions, and ultimately your entire future. If you've ever felt stuck, held back, or trapped in your own thinking, what you're about to hear will challenge the way you see your mind forever. Negative thoughts are often misunderstood. Most people assume that because a negative thought appears, it must mean something about who they are or what their future will be. But that's not how the mind actually works. A thought appearing is not a verdict. It's not a prophecy. It's not even a reflection of truth in many cases. It's simply a mental event, something generated by past experiences, fears, patterns, and environments you've been exposed to over time. The key realization is this: negative thoughts are not inherently powerful. They only become powerful when you treat them as important. The mind produces thousands of thoughts every single day, many of them random, repetitive, and automatic. You don't consciously choose most of them. They arise on their own. But what determines their impact is not their existence. It's your response to them. When a negative thought appears, such as, "I'm not capable," or "this is going to go wrong," most people make a subtle but critical mistake. They assume the thought deserves attention. They pause. They analyze it. They emotionally engage with it. And in doing so, they begin to build a relationship with it. The thought, once just a passing mental occurrence, now becomes something they revisit, reconsider, and reinforce. That's where the shift happens. Not at the moment of appearance, but at the moment of attention. Attention is the currency of the mind. Whatever you consistently pay attention to becomes more prominent, more believable, and more influential. So when you repeatedly give attention to negative thoughts, you are not just noticing them. You are strengthening them. You are training your mind to treat them as relevant, even if they are inaccurate or exaggerated. This is why two people can have the same negative thought, yet experience completely different outcomes. One person dismisses it as background noise and continues forward. The other internalizes it, dwells on it, and allows it to shape their decisions. The difference is not intelligence, ability, or even circumstances. The difference is awareness and control over attention. It's important to understand that the mind is designed to protect you. It scans for threats, anticipates risks, and tries to keep you safe by highlighting potential problems. But in modern life, that same mechanism can become overactive. It begins to interpret uncertainty as danger, challenges as threats, and growth as something to avoid. As a result, it produces thoughts that feel urgent, convincing, and sometimes even realistic, but are actually rooted in caution rather than truth. So when a negative thought arises, it doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means your mind is doing what it has been conditioned to do. The real question is not why the thought appeared, but why you are choosing to give it authority. Because authority is not inherent in the thought itself. Authority is granted by you. The moment you treat a thought as meaningful, it begins to influence your emotions. And once your emotions are influenced, your behavior follows. That's how a simple, fleeting thought can quietly shape your confidence, your decisions, and ultimately your direction in life. But here's where control becomes possible. You can observe a thought without agreeing with it. You can notice a thought without engaging it. You can acknowledge its presence without assigning it meaning. This shift from identification to observation is where mental freedom begins. Instead of reacting automatically, you create a pause. In that pause, you recognize this is just a thought, not a command. It does not require belief. It does not require action. It does not require fear. It simply exists, and like all thoughts, it will pass if you do not feed it. When you stop feeding negative thoughts with attention, emotional energy, and repetition, they begin to lose intensity. Not because you fought them, but because you stop sustaining them. And in that space, your mind becomes clearer, more focused, and more aligned with what actually matters. This is not about suppressing your inner world. Suppression often makes thoughts stronger. This is about changing your relationship with your thoughts entirely. Instead of being directed by them, you begin to observe them, evaluate them, and choose whether they deserve space in your thinking. Over time, this practice builds mental resilience. You stop being easily influenced by every passing idea. You stop overreacting to internal noise. And you develop the ability to stay grounded even when your mind is uncertain. That stability is what allows you to act with clarity rather than hesitation. So the presence of negative thoughts is not the problem. The problem begins when they are treated as truth without examination. When you recognize them for what they are, temporary, automatic, and often unreliable, you regain control. And that control changes everything. Because once you understand that negative thoughts are allowed to exist, but not allowed to lead, you stop living reactively and start living intentionally. And in that moment, your mind is no longer your obstacle, it becomes your tool. The shift is simple, but powerful thoughts may appear, but they no longer decide who you become. You cannot control every thought that enters your mind. That's the reality most people resist. Yet it's the starting point of real mental discipline. Thoughts arise automatically, shaped by memory, emotion, environment, and habit. They don't ask permission before showing up. And because of that, many people feel powerless, as if the presence of a thought already means something significant. But the real power was never in controlling the first thought. The real power lies in what you do next. That space immediately after a thought appears is where your responsibility begins. Not before it, not during its formation, but right after you become aware of it. In that moment, you have a choice. You can repeat the thought, reinforce it, and allow it to deepen. Or you can question it, challenge it, and replace it with something more accurate and constructive. That second thought is not automatic. It's intentional, and that's why it matters. Most people unconsciously skip this step. A negative thought appears. I'm going to fail. I'm not good enough. This will go wrong. And instead of pausing, they accept it. They don't examine its validity. They don't ask whether it's helpful or even true. They react emotionally, and that emotional reaction strengthens the thought. Once strengthened, the thought begins to feel like reality, even if it's not grounded in evidence. But when you begin to understand that you are responsible for the second thought, everything shifts. Responsibility doesn't mean blame. It means awareness and control over your response. It means recognizing that while the first thought may be automatic, the second thought is where you reclaim agency. That is where you decide whether the thought will influence your emotions or whether it will be redirected. This is where many people underestimate their own power. They assume that because a thought feels convincing, it must be accurate. But thoughts are not always trustworthy simply because they feel strong. Fear-based thoughts often carry urgency. Doubt-based thoughts often carry repetition. But neither urgency nor repetition is proof of truth. They are just signals that require evaluation, not automatic belief. So instead of asking, "Why am I thinking this?" the more effective question becomes, "Do I need to believe this?" That question creates distance between you and the thought. It allows you to step out of automatic agreement and into conscious evaluation. In that space, you are no longer reacting as the thought's subject. You are responding as its observer. And when you respond, you have options. You can reframe the thought into something more accurate. For example, a thought like, "I'm not ready," can be replaced with, "I am prepared enough to begin, and I will improve through action." A thought like, "I will fail," can be replaced with, "I may face challenges, but I will learn and adjust." These are not empty affirmations. They are grounded, rational responses that challenge distortion with clarity. The key is not to eliminate the thought, but to interrupt its influence. Because a thought without reinforcement is temporary. It passes. But a thought that is repeated, emotionally charged, and believed becomes embedded. That embedding process is what turns a fleeting idea into a limiting belief. By taking responsibility for the second thought, you prevent that embedding. You stop the chain reaction before it fully forms. Instead of letting a negative thought spiral into a pattern, you intervene early. That intervention is subtle, but powerful. It prevents escalation, it preserves clarity, and over time, it rewires how your mind processes internal dialogue. This practice also builds mental independence. You become less dependent on external validation or internal reassurance. You stop outsourcing your sense of direction to whatever your mind happens to produce in the moment. Instead, you develop a consistent internal standard. Not every thought qualifies as guidance. Not every feeling deserves obedience. Some require correction, not compliance. And this is where discipline becomes essential. Because choosing your second thought is not always comfortable. It requires you to challenge familiar patterns. It requires you to question what feels automatic. It requires you to slow down in moments where your instinct is to react quickly. But that pause is where control is established. Over time, this habit strengthens your mental clarity. You begin to notice patterns in your thinking. You become aware of recurring distortions, recurring doubts, recurring assumptions. And once you see them clearly, they lose their unconscious grip. What once influenced you without resistance now becomes something you can recognize and redirect in real time. That is the difference between living on autopilot and living with intention. Autopilot accepts the first thought. Intention evaluates the second. So when a negative thought appears, don't rush to eliminate it, and don't accept it without question. Pause. Recognize it, and then respond with awareness. That response is where your power is exercised, because you are not defined by the thoughts that enter your mind. You are defined by the thoughts you choose to continue. And the moment you take responsibility for that choice, you stop being a passive observer of your mind and start becoming the one who leads it. Your thoughts are not isolated events. They are not random fragments that exist without consequence. Over time, what you consistently think begins to shape what you believe, and what you believe quietly becomes the framework through which you see yourself and the world around you. This is how identity is formed, not in a single moment, but through repetition, reinforcement, and internal acceptance. When a negative thought is repeated often enough, it stops feeling like a passing idea and starts feeling like a description of who you are. A thought like, "I'm not capable," may begin as doubt, but if it is revisited frequently, it gradually transforms into a belief. And once a belief is formed, it no longer feels optional. It feels like truth. From there, it begins to influence not just how you think, but how you act. This is where the process becomes significant. Thoughts influence beliefs, beliefs shape identity, and identity drives behavior. And behavior, repeated over time, becomes your life. So what may seem like a harmless internal narrative is actually the foundation upon which your decisions, habits, and outcomes are built. This is why two individuals with similar abilities can end up in very different places. It's not always talent or opportunity that separates them. Often, it's the internal dialogue they've been repeating for years. One person consistently thinks in terms of limitation, while the other thinks in terms of possibility. One reinforces doubt, while the other reinforces capability. And over time, those patterns produce entirely different trajectories. The mind is always working to maintain consistency between what you believe and how you act. So if your internal narrative tells you that you are not confident, your behavior will naturally align with that belief. You may avoid opportunities, hesitate in conversations, or second-guess decisions, not because you lack ability, but because your identity has been shaped by repeated internal messaging. This is why negative thinking is not just a temporary experience. It's a structural influence. It quietly builds a lens through which everything is interpreted. And once that lens is established, it filters your perception of challenges, opportunities, and even your own potential. But here's the critical point: identity is not fixed. It is formed through repetition, which means it can also be reformed through repetition. The same mechanism that creates limiting beliefs can also create empowering ones. The difference lies in what you choose to consistently think, reinforce, and accept. When you begin to consciously interrupt negative thought patterns and replace them with more accurate and constructive ones, you are not just changing your thoughts in the moment. You are gradually reshaping your identity. Each time you challenge a limiting thought, you weaken its influence. Each time you reinforce a more constructive perspective, you strengthen a new internal standard. This process requires consistency. A single positive thought will not override years of negative conditioning, but repeated intentional thinking will gradually rewire how you see yourself. Over time, what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel natural. Confidence replaces hesitation. Clarity replaces confusion. Direction replaces doubt. It's important to recognize that identity is not only how you see yourself, but also how you respond under pressure. When challenges arise, your automatic response is influenced by your internal narrative. If your identity is rooted in doubt, your response will reflect avoidance or hesitation. If your identity is rooted in capability, your response will reflect engagement and problem solving. So, when you change your thinking, you are not just improving your mindset, you are redefining your default reactions. And that shift is what determines long-term outcomes. Many people try to change their lives by focusing only on external actions without addressing the internal beliefs driving those actions. But sustainable change starts from within. If the underlying identity remains the same, behavior will eventually revert. That's why temporary motivation often fails, while consistent internal work produces lasting transformation. This is where awareness becomes powerful. When you begin to notice the thoughts you repeatedly entertain, you start to see the patterns that have been shaping your identity. And once you see those patterns clearly, you are no longer unconsciously controlled by them. You can begin to question them, adjust them, and replace them with something more aligned with who you want to become. You are not locked into the identity your past thinking has created. You are continuously shaping it through your present thinking. Every moment of awareness, every intentional response, every thought you choose to reinforce is contributing to the person you are becoming. So, the question is not just what you think in a single moment. The question is what you consistently allow yourself to think over time. Because in the end, your life will not rise above the level of your dominant thoughts, and your identity will reflect the patterns you have repeated, accepted, and believed. And once you understand that your thoughts are actively constructing who you are, you stop treating them casually and start treating them as the building blocks of your future. Real control over your mind does not come from trying to eliminate every negative thought that appears. That approach often leads to frustration because the mind is not designed to be silent or perfectly controlled at all times. Thoughts will come and go. Some will be helpful, some will not. The difference is not in their existence, but in how you respond to them. And that's where discipline becomes the foundation of real mental strength. Instead of resisting negative thoughts, the more effective approach is to replace them with something more accurate, more constructive, and more aligned with the direction you want your life to take. Resistance tends to create tension. It keeps your attention locked on the very thoughts you are trying to avoid. Replacement, on the other hand, shifts your focus forward. It redirects your energy toward something more useful, rather than keeping you anchored to what is unhelpful. Think of your mind as something that can be trained, not controlled in the sense of force, but guided through consistency. Every time a negative thought appears, you are presented with an opportunity to either follow it or redirect it. Over time, the choice you make repeatedly becomes your default pattern. If you consistently engage with negative thinking, your mind becomes more comfortable in that space. But if you consistently challenge and replace those thoughts, your mind begins to adopt a more balanced and constructive way of processing information. This is not about denying reality. It's about responding to reality in a way that keeps you effective. A negative thought like, "This is too difficult," can be acknowledged, but it does not have to be accepted as final. It can be replaced with a more grounded perspective such as, "This may be challenging, but I can approach it step by step. The situation has not changed, but your interpretation of it has." And that shift in interpretation directly influences your emotional state and your actions. Discipline in this context is not about perfection. It's about consistency. You will not replace every negative thought perfectly every time, but the goal is not perfection. The goal is direction. Each time you catch a negative thought and choose to redirect it, you strengthen your ability to do it again in the future. It becomes easier with repetition. What once required effort begins to happen more naturally as your mind adapts to this new pattern. This process also requires honesty with yourself. Replacing a thought is not about using empty affirmations that you don't believe at all. The replacement must be something you can reasonably accept, something that aligns with evidence or possibility. For example, replacing "I am a failure" with "I am successful in everything" may feel unrealistic if your experience doesn't support it. But replacing it with "I am still learning and improving through experience" is both truthful and constructive. The mind responds better to statements it can trust. Over time, this practice builds mental resilience. You stop reacting impulsively to every internal signal and start responding with intention. You develop the ability to pause, assess, and redirect. That pause is small, but it is powerful. It creates a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap lies your ability to choose. As this habit develops, something subtle begins to change. Negative thoughts no longer feel like threats. They become signals that you can interpret and manage. Instead of being overwhelmed by them, you become familiar with them, and familiarity reduces their intensity. What once had control over your emotions begins to lose its influence, because you are no longer reinforcing it. This is how mental training works, not through force, but through repetition and awareness. Each moment you choose to replace a negative thought with a more constructive one, you are reinforcing a new mental pathway. And like any skill, the more you practice it, the more automatic it becomes. Eventually, you reach a point where your default response is no longer to dwell on negative thinking, but to redirect it almost immediately. That doesn't mean negative thoughts stop appearing. It means they no longer determine your direction. They become brief signals, not long-term influences. And this is the essence of discipline, not eliminating discomfort, but learning how to respond to it effectively. You don't need a perfectly quiet mind to move forward. You need a trained mind that knows how to refocus when necessary. So instead of asking how to stop negative thoughts completely, the more powerful question is how to respond to them consistently. Because your responses, repeated over time, define your mental environment. And your mental environment influences your decisions, your confidence, and your outcomes. When you commit to replacing rather than resisting, you shift from a reactive mindset to a deliberate one. You stop being at the mercy of your thoughts and start guiding them with purpose. And that shift, although subtle, is what separates distraction from discipline and hesitation from progress. In the end, control is not about silencing your mind. It's about training it to work with you instead of against you.